matters. With no further ado, over to you, Dan.
Thanks very much, John. And thanks to the Labour Housing Group for having me. It's really nice to hear from you and have a chance to share what we're doing with people who are so involved with Labour politics. I'm going to talk about just briefly so I'm supposed to be talking about what needs to change post June. So this topic had been set when we were still unclear about what was going to happen to the evictions ban. So I'm going to talk a bit about the problem, what we think needs to happen to around evictions, following on from what Thangham's just been saying. Talking a bit about the real underlying problem, which is rent arrears, and then a little bit more about rent levels overall. I'm going to be cheeky and come in very quickly on the question about policing and illegal evictions. One thought that we have is on where police aren't very familiar with the Prevention of Eviction Act, Protection from Eviction Act even. We need police and crime commissioners to have a role in really leading reform in that area. As Renters' Rights London has mentioned in the comments, the Mayor of London has brought in an NGO, Safer Renting, to train the Met Police on that. So I think that's something that should be done up and down the country, and that might be something for next year's elections, assuming they go ahead. So back to my topic. So the problem that we have, that Generation Rent has been dealing with and looking at closely, is that the economic shock of arising from the pandemic and lockdown mean that despite the increase in support that we've had from the government, so in terms of the furlough scheme and in terms of increases in universal credit, rent arrears have trebled. So from about 4% of the private rented population to 13%, according to polling. So that's basically people who have lost income as a result of the crisis, and they're not getting support from the welfare system. They're effectively falling through rather gaping holes in the safety net. We've recently done some research which was published this week, which found that if there's a proportionate increase in homelessness, that means that 45,000 households would be getting evicted for rent arrears this year, which is an 11% increase in overall homelessness levels, which amounts to roughly 117 million costs to councils if we extrapolate what homelessness is already costing. So that's sort of the human cost and the public, the cost to the public as well, not even sort of taking into account the health costs that arise from that, and just generally the wider economic costs. We're obviously also concerned that there remain enormous public health issues. Infections have obviously fallen, but having people moving home when they shouldn't need to is still dangerous in this present situation with the virus. Not only are people who've lost income getting into arrears, but we've also got quite a lot of people who are having to run down their savings. They don't qualify for universal credit if they have substantial savings. Let's say they're saving up for their first home. So if people are having to run down their savings in order to keep themselves in their home, then that ought to be quite a sore spot for the government, who is really focusing on raising home ownership levels. So that's something to bear in mind. If the safety net isn't helping these people as well. I think the one problem arising from rent arrears is that even if incomes recover, you've had several months where incomes have been completely destroyed for a lot of these people who are in rent arrears. So it's very unsustainable to require tenants to pay back arrears that that have built up over recent months, especially because rents are already unaffordable for many, more than a third of incomes for most renters, and so we have a real rent debt crisis, as we're calling it. If a lot of renters are in arrears and are likely to stay in arrears, even if jobs and incomes recover quickly, which we don't think they will, the way things are going. Even if the government's unlocking the economy, if we haven't defeated the virus, the economy is going to be subdued for a long time to come. There's also a big lack of fairness generally, that people with the least wealth, renters, by definition don't have a property, are being asked to cover the cost of the pandemic. So that comes not only in having to pay the rent, so their rent's still due, as the government has said, but as well as being, renters have borne the cost in other ways, such as being confined to the most cramped homes, and poorest quality homes as well, so suffering from the mental health issues of being cooped up with a lot of other people, and facing damp conditions which can affect their physical health, as they can't leave their home very easily. So that's the problem that we're faced with. The solution, as we see it, the government's obviously said this week, they confirmed that they had intimated earlier that the evictions ban is going to be lifted from the 24th of August. And it's interesting that, from what Thangham said a moment ago, that there are sort of legitimate eviction claims for antisocial behaviour and so on, and it's interesting to note that the landlord associations are saying, despite welcoming the news that eviction bans going to be lifted and so on, which is a little bit crass, that they are saying it's these antisocial behaviour cases that need to be prioritised, and so that's something to be aware of, that even the landlords are saying that there are some eviction cases that take precedence. I think there is generally a recognition that people shouldn't be forced out of their homes, even though the government has sort of backtracked on what they said originally, that anyone affected by COVID shouldn't lose their home. They've now said they shouldn't lose their home this summer, which is frustrating. So what we're calling for is to continue to suspend Section 21 evictions, make sure that evictions, so there's a ground 8 in Section 8 evictions, which means that if you have a certain amount of rent arrears, then courts have to give the landlord possession order over your home. So that needs to be suspended. Both those need to be suspended as long as there are thousands of renters who have built up rent arrears. And we have campaigned alongside Acorn for the abolition of Section 21, and we need to see that expedited. But in the meantime, I think it's key that Section 21 remains suspended, because if that's opened up again, then landlords will simply use these no-fault grounds to evict people, regardless of whether they have arrears, or if they're well, they don't need a reason at all. So revenge evictions, for example, could still take place. Another one thing to quickly say on that is that many Section 21s take place because landlords want to sell up, and there may be quite a lot of landlords who decide that this is what they need to do at the moment. They can't. It's no longer economical for them to rent out property. We should prevent them from removing tenants, and other landlords should be taking over. I mean, we'd love to see councils and other social landlords taking over private rented properties at this time. I think this is a good opportunity for that to happen. As I mentioned before, the reason rent arrears is so high is that the safety net has too many holes. So you know, it's basically not what the safety net we currently have isn't even good enough for good economic times, even with the increase in local housing allowance to the 30th percentile. So when we're facing the worst recession in centuries, you know, we're still, you know, we need even more support to ride out this period. So, you know, a couple of problems with it is as it stands, is that the benefit cap is undermining the increase in local housing allowance, which means a lot of expensive areas, or if you're a young adult, you get not as much as what the headline figure would suggest you get. So we need to first we need to fix the safety net. That means ending restrictions on eligibility for people with no recourse to public funds, young adults, people with savings as well, just on the basis of fairness, and also raise local housing allowance to the median. That would address the fact that it's so basically the economic impact has affected people who have been in very well-paying jobs, but and so are therefore renting maybe more expensive properties, but they have no idea when they're going to be able to return to work and return to an income where they can sustain that tenancy. So that's why we need a LHA increase to the median, particularly right now. I mean, there are arguments to have it at the median anyway, but it's this particular situation. We need much a much more robust safety net. Then there's people who will be paying more than the median who can't afford it, or there are people who are otherwise unable to benefit from the full from the welfare safety net, which is it brings us on to what we've come out with this week, which is a coronavirus home retention scheme. So this recognises that even if you sort of lift the safety net to new levels, there will still be rent arrears. There will still be a lot of people who are facing homelessness. The government should be stepping in to help them, but at the same time, we don't want the government to simply prop up existing unaffordable rent levels, which were set before the pandemic. So we need a system in similar in principle to Acorn's rent waiver idea, which they've done a lot of great leadership on, so not basically guaranteeing landlord's income, but only to a certain amount. So we've picked 80% of the rent as what a landlord could get. This would address the issue about simply cancelling rent would effectively deprive landlords of rights enshrined in the Human Rights Act. And so on that basis, you're preventing a homelessness crisis, clearing renters' debts, avoiding a situation where the state is supporting unsustainable rent levels, while also proportionately preserving the landlord's position. So that's how that's something that we brought out this week, and we see it as a way of ending the rent debt crisis in a fair and legal way. So I can share that if anyone hasn't seen it. I'll say a little bit more about rent levels quickly. So in the wider market, we ought to see rents falling as a result of the economic shock caused by lockdown. At the moment, we don't see much evidence of this. There's still quite a few different indicators showing rents are going up. That said, the market is just opening up, so it'll take a while before it settles down and we've seen what the new levels are like. One problem is, even if market rents come down, there's a lot of renters who are in tenancies. They don't have any negotiating power. They can only really only formally negotiate down rent if they threaten to move out, and that's a privilege for only some renters. There's a lot of renters who are vulnerable. They're maybe shielding and can't risk moving home, so they can't, because they can't negotiate effectively. We need some mechanism to make sure that any falls in rents are enjoyed by renters, whether they're starting a new tenancy or in existing tenancies. The interesting thing is that the government government's been pretty opposed to any interference in rent levels, but their principle is that the market should be setting rents. So if the rental market is collapsing and rents are falling, then they should be making it more affordable for all renters. So that's something that's potential to talk about in the next few months. So that's sort of, yeah, I've kept it to kind of the immediate policy questions, and yeah, happy to take questions a little later. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Dan. I'm going to bring in our next speaker, and then we'll take some questions at the end of this panel. So I'd like to hand over to Jacky Peacock, who's a former councillor and cabinet member for housing, I believe, in addition to being the director of Advice for Renters, who provides specialist advice and representation for private tenants. Jacky's going to talk a little bit about the need for change over the longer term, and I think perhaps with a bit of a London focus as well. So over to you, Jacky.
Okay, thanks very much, John. Yes, being asked to talk about the longer term, but I think we need to see it in the context, of course, of where we are now and also where we have been in the past. And also, although we're really very pleased, of course, that you are going to focus today on developing policies for private rented sector, obviously, as Thangam and others have pointed out, it has to be seen in the context of housing as a whole and what role private rented sector could and should be playing and how it does protect tenants. Just a very quick word about Advice for Renters. We are based in northwest London, so as John points out, our focus is primarily London, but we do keep an eye on the big picture, and I'm not going to restrict my comments to London, although obviously there is a huge focus, and where we're based is in Brent, which has one of the largest private rented sectors in London, and also, of course, has a very high, it's one of the highest boroughs for the ethnic group mix of communities, and sad to say, as you probably know, it's also looks like being the borough with the highest number of COVID deaths for reasons that we're only just starting to understand. But despite the tragedies and despite all the hardships that we're facing, others have realised as well that the fact we've now got such a low EBIT economically and socially, this actually creates opportunities as well, because yes, I keep having to remind Thangam of that we need to realise the government we've got and how difficult it is, but it is creating opportunities, and the fact that we've seen communities coming together. I don't go along with the analogies people have made about the last war and the pandemic, but there are certain things that you realise, and one is that people have, whether it's through mutual aid groups or other channels, different parts of the community have actually been linking up, and people have realised that those that are worse off than they may be, it isn't those people over the road, you know, particularly in London, people rich and poor live cheek by jowl, and the fact that they've been reaching out and making them realise this isn't some foreign breed of people or somebody, well, you know, there's always an underlying assumption that if people are poor, well, they must be doing something wrong, or if they're not employed, well, maybe they just can't get up in the morning. People realise now that they can empathise more, and I think one of the challenges is that we keep that community cohesion as we come out of the COVID environment. Long-term changes, well, although we talk about them as new initiatives, in actual fact, what we prefer to talk about is restoring tenants' rights, because tenants did have security of tenure, they did have controlled rents. I see Heather nodding away, because we used to, when I first came into private rented campaigning, we were arguing that fair rents were not fair enough. And for those of you who don't know about fair rents, they still apply to regulated tenancies. There hasn't been a new one since 1988, 1989. So, you know, what we're really talking about is looking to restore the kind of protections that we had in the past before the 1980s, when the whole deregulation of the private rented sector came in under Margaret Thatcher as just one element of their big drive to what they called roll back the state. And, you know, all the nationalised industries, for example, that we had after the war, introduced, of course, as part of Labour's building the welfare state, were all dismantled, and sadly they've continued to be dismantled through all the years of austerity. So I want to touch on rents and conditions in the private rented sector, but of course it's a waste of time talking about those unless we've first restore security of tenure, because even now tenants do have rights to challenge their rents legally, and thanks to Karen Buck, they do have a right to insist that their homes are fit for human habitation. But if tenants think, well, as a result of doing that, I'll probably lose my home altogether, well, obviously they're going to be pretty reluctant to exercise those rights. So absolutely don't need to say a lot about it because everybody's touched on it, but we have got to see security of tenure. And yes, Thangam, it is a huge battle. I mean, we know, I follow the landlord websites and things as well because it's really instructive. So you've probably seen as well that landlords have clearly been told by Boris Johnson that this legislation is going to be kicked into the long grass. They're making all sorts of excuses for it, but I just think that we all have a role, just hold the government's feet to the fire until they do introduce it. So it's got to be coming from every single source. I just want to go back a little bit as well to talk about the landlord-tenant relationship, because in this country particularly, it seems to go more, it's more entrenched than it is probably certainly in other Western countries. And for that, we probably need to go back centuries, because the imbalance between the landlord and tenant relationship hasn't actually changed since feudal times. I mean, it's astonishing, but if you want to follow it through, you can see the history from when it was the lord of the manor, you know, and all the tenants in the, you know, they owned the whole land, whether it was rural or even as we started to urbanize. and even to this day, of course, we call, who is the person we rent from? It is the landlord. And I would just love, it really grates on me so much, I would just love Labour to come up with some alternative names. And maybe, you know, in France it's the rentier. I mean, maybe we should have a rentor and a rentier or something. But, you know, great competition if you want. Let's think of new names for this. That's because I do think names are important in underlying assumptions. And going from back in far history to today, the whole Black Lives Matter has reminded us about the uncomfortable truths about our history. And people, of course, who made their fortunes from the slave trade, what did they do with that money? They invested it in property. And that's why, you know, to this day, landowners are, you know, increasing their wealth. So that, you know, the inequalities just go on from year to year. Even in, and most of the property wealth gap continues because of our tax system. So, I mean, crucial to reforming property and tenancies is actually looking at the tax law as well. But for example, between 2016 and 2018, the top 10%'s wealth increased by 11%, in contrast to an increase in wealth from the bottom 10% of just 3%. So the gap is growing wider and wider year on year on year, unless we really do something about it. And even in terms of, again, assumptions, we may think that we don't, you know, we have changed from that old, you know, feudal system, but it irritates me when we talk about shared ownership, we talk about staircasing up and staircasing down, you know, and it may be 150 years since you actually had to own property to have a vote in this country. You know, we've still got that such entrenched, you know, your property status is your status in society. And we've, you know, Labour just does have to really look at how we can possibly move away from that. I have to assume we will get security of tenure in order to talk about rents. And again, rents were protected for many years. And when housing benefit was first introduced, it actually covered the rents, whatever it was. You just said, this is my rent, and you got your housing benefit that equated to that. And then, of course, in the early 1990s, the phrase that has come down through time is when Sir George Young was the housing minister and was boldly saying, oh, well, we don't have to worry. This was a point, I should say, when up to that time, the reason rents weren't an enormous problem was because the actual bricks and mortar was subsidised. Landlords actually got subsidies from the government to produce housing. And when they moved away from that, and there was a huge concern about what the impact would be on rent levels. Of course, Sir George Young said, you know, housing benefit will underpin market rents. We've made this absolutely clear. If people cannot afford to pay that market rent, housing benefit will take the strain. Well, we all know what happened. I don't need to go into any more detail in that. But of course, what did they do? Not think, well, we better actually put a cap on rents. We better bring back regulated rents or anything like that. No, they just capped the benefits. So, and whether they really sincerely thought that that would have any impact on capping the rents themselves, I don't know. I suspect not, but there we are. What we've got now, I mean, we can see in our own borough, which is not the smartest place in the world, it's not uncommon to see the gap between the benefit or the housing element of universal credit and the actual rent of £100 a week. What, you know, how on earth can anybody find a gap of that size? I mean, it is just completely unrealistic. So broadly, what we've been arguing for is that we should go back to a similar model that tenants, you know, with the old regulated kind of tenancies still have, which is that your rent is registered. Now, that involves it being valued by a rent officer, which is now part of the valuation office. And personally, I actually think it's doable. But if you did think, well, you can't do that because of the sheer volume, I mean, I think it's reasonable to say that the private rented sector now is double what it was when fair rents were in their heyday. But what you could do as an alternative is you could set a standard rent for each size of property in each particular locality. And then if the landlord thought, well, my property is much better quality than standard, well, they could apply for a higher rent. And equally, if the tenant thought my property is pretty shitty and I don't think it's worth a standard rent, well, they could apply as well. And then the rent officer could actually inspect those property and determine an actual rent. And if either party wants to agree, then as now, they can appeal to the property tribunal. So that's the model that we favour. Just moving on to conditions, we've long argued that what we really need is a national regulatory scheme. And I hold my hand up now and apologise for the fact that we and others spent at least 2 decades arguing for licensing, and we've spent most of the time since then arguing to get rid of it because it just doesn't work from almost anybody's perspective. So what we do need is a national regulatory scheme. All landlords have to do, it couldn't be simpler, they just upload evidence online that the property that renting is fit and proper. And thanks to Karen, we just use the criteria in that act to be the criteria for that. And in addition, they have to provide evidence that they or an agent, if they're using an agent, is fit and proper and competent to manage both the property and the tenancy. It would take about 5 minutes once a year. They pay a sum, which whatever it would be a great deal less than the fees they have to pay for licensing, and it would be 100% effective. All local authorities then would have to do, instead of chasing, you know, this completely unrealistic idea that they can inspect every property in their area every year and serve notices. It's extraordinarily time consuming. All they would have to do is watch out for the ones, and it's a public register. You have your, once you've registered with the regulatory body, it's on, you know, it's easy to find people who aren't registered. So all the local authority has to do is pick up those unregulated arrangements and prosecute the landlords. So that, in our view, would have a major impact on conditions. But obviously that will take time. I should say, I used to do judo when I was much younger, and I've always realized it's a really good lesson. You know, if you're up against a much larger body, then just going in with a straight punch, you're always going to lose. So what you need to do is get the bigger body to use their own weight to pull them over. And with that in mind, whenever we want to push for a big change in the system, we go to the landlord lobby. And actually, when you talk to landlords and agents at the top end of the market, they want the same thing that we do, because they hate bad landlords as much as tenants do, frankly. So in this case, we're pushing at an open door. And in fact, they've done a huge amount of work on our regulatory model, and they're even trialing it voluntarily. Hunters are using it for all their properties, and they say it's fantastic. Even on a voluntary basis, landlords they haven't had any complaints from landlords at all about it. So that's good news, and it's, you know, we really are pushing at an open door and trying to get that through. So I just wanted to finish by just saying a few words about fuel poverty, because that is obviously one of the key issues. And apart from all the many problems that private tenants face, and particularly those at the bottom end of the market, where of course the most vulnerable families live, the most common factor, if you leave aside all the things like the drainage problems and the lack of proper cooking facilities or bathing, and all the infestations that are so frequent at that end of the market, the major problem is people are living in cold and damp homes. So if you bear with me, I just want to give you a few stats that I really think we should be thinking about in the light of COVID. Around 10,000 extra winter deaths every single year are caused by cold homes. Just bear that in mind when we're thinking about our response to COVID deaths. Public Health England state that there is clear evidence of the links between cold temperatures and respiratory problems. They lower resistance to respiratory infections and can increase the risk of respiratory illness. Damp and mold are associated with a 30 to 50% increase in respiratory problems. And in terms of the scale of the problem, there are already 2.4 million households in fuel poverty, and many of them are even now in really severe distress. Fuel poverty is set to rocket as an additional 1.79 million people become unemployed by the end of 2020. And over 30% of households where someone is unemployed are fuel poor. Energy bills have leapt up by 37% since people have been unemployed or working from home. And that means that hundreds and thousands of people will be at risk of fuel poverty and the worst effects of COVID-19 unless urgent action is taken. And if we do get another spike, God forbid, but we know it's got to be likely, if we get another spike in the autumn or winter season, if we don't address fuel poverty, it is going to be utterly catastrophic. And the hospitals just will not cope. So we have to address right now increasing energy efficiency in people's homes. It's not only vital for health reasons, but it could be a key factor in building us out of the recession, because it's going to create tens of thousands of jobs. All the structure there to do it, it could start tomorrow. I work with colleagues who know much more about the area of energy efficiency than I do, but they absolutely assure me that it's shovel ready. We could start tomorrow. So I'd just like to leave you with that thought, and thanks very much.
Thank you, thank you, Jacky. That was again very thorough and thought-provoking. I'm conscious in terms of time. We've drifted a little bit off the times as advertised, and we were due to go to a short comfort break. I'm just wondering, do people want to still do that, or are we happy to just carry on? I'll be guided by what people want to do. Should we continue on? And what I'll do then is just bring in a couple of questions before we go to the breakout sessions. Paul, Martin, you've got a question around the retention scheme. Can I bring you in to ask that? I think you should be able to unmute yourself direct, Paul.
I've slightly lost track of that, John. I think I might have to pass on that one.
Yeah, you made an observation around generation rents retention scheme would need something like rent control to provide a baseline.
That I was just trying to understand how their calculation would work if you didn't have a benchmark for what was a reasonable and fair rent. So I would just like perhaps a little explanation on that.
So the way we envisage our scheme working, and this is by no means a sort of cast iron sort of only way this will work idea. Is sort of we're hoping to get a bit of debate going around it. So it'd be based on landlords applying for their own relief, essentially, if their tenant can't pay the rent. So they'd be going to their council to apply for this with evidence of what rent was due under the contract with their tenant. So it would be 80% of what had been agreed at the start of the tenancy. So it's based on market rent, but it'd be 20% less than that. So that's I think, given that the economy's already shrunk by 10%, we're expecting sort of market rents should be falling by that sort of magnitude as well. It's set up not to rely on a centralized idea of rents, but that's certainly another way of looking at it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Portia, I think you've got a question for Dan as well. Would you like to come in?
Oh, thank you. I've written my question. I've got an unstable connection, which is why my video isn't on. Dan, it's nice to see you today, Dan. Hello. On
Hi.
the 22nd of January, Baroness Grenda introduced the Rented Homes Bill to the Lords, and that bill would also end eviction under Section 21. She's not stupid. She knew what the Tories would do. So she'd already, she isn't. She's always a friend to renters. Now that Alicia Kennedy has joined you at Generation Rent as your new director, can you assure us, do you know whether she's working to ensure swift passage of the Rented Homes Bill, since this Renters Reforms Bill has been, oh, I can see that Tangam, the shadow minister, has her hand up, but because you work with her. So I wondered if you could give us some insight as to what's happening with the Rented Homes Bill, because that is now our best chance of ending Section 21 fast.
It's definitely a way that pressure can be put on the government as part of this. I think it could be a vehicle if we sort of focused on reforming evictions. What happened previously? So we've worked with Baroness Grenda for a number of years now, quite closely, and she in 2016 had a bill to abolish letting fees, and that got through to the second reading, I think possibly even the committee stage in the Lords, and then that pushed the government basically the following week to announce that it was going to be banning letting fees. Granted, it did take a couple of years for them to actually bring in the bill, but it's the way we see it is it's probably unlikely that a private members bill like that would become law. It would just it serves a purpose for keeping pressure on the government.
John, is it all right if I just mention private members bills? Unfortunately, the time available in Parliament in both houses for private members bills controlled by the government, and we've had no Friday sittings for private members bills in our house. And as I understand it, the Lords are similarly limited at the moment. I mean, private members bills in any case very rarely get to law because the government can always stick in what's called a money resolution to block them or use various other devices. However, the problem at the moment isn't even that, it's that government is controlling the parliamentary time so tightly that I'm not even sure that Baroness Grenda's bill is going to get to its next stage. But I'm going to go and seek it out and see what we can do, because as Dan said, they're often a really good way of giving an issue an airing, even if they don't get to law.
Exactly. Thank you.
Right, thank you. I'm going to suggest that we now move on to our breakout groups, where we're looking to focus on two questions really: what needs to change now and what needs to change for the long term.